Okay, looks like we're ready to go. This is I'm Jonathan Duler, and I'm one of the directors at Basic Expert. I started the business about 5 years ago, and this is our very first webinar. I will be moderating it. We've got topic for today is your deemed to satisfy compliant building unsafe? And the panelists that we have today are Jonathan Barnett. So Dr. Jonathan Barnett is an internationally acclaimed technical expert in the fire safety engineering field with over 40 years experience in the area. Previously a professor at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in the United States, Jonathan has researched topics such as computer modeling of fire, structural fire protection, combustible cladding, and the development of new fire test standards. Today, he's the Managing Director of Basic Expert, a specialist forensic engineering and fire engineering firm, focusing on helping people with non-compliant buildings deal with dangerous cladding, inappropriate essential safety measures such as fire alarm systems, fire detection, fire-rated doors, and the like, and helping them with building rectifications from design to permits to construction and through the legal quagmire of litigation. Next panelist is Andrew Cialini. Andrew is the State Building Surveyor with the Victorian Building Authority. He has qualifications in civil engineering and building surveying and has over 30 years of industry experience. 9 years as a structural design engineer and over 20 years as a building surveyor. He has been heavily involved in the use of performance solutions, both as a statutory building surveyor and a consulting building surveyor to achieve best project outcomes. Steve Baxas. Stephen is the municipal building surveyor for the City of Melbourne and has been for the last, pardon me, brain fart moment. Steve Baxas is the municipal building surveyor for the City of Melbourne with 30 years of local government experience. Stephen has been the municipal building surveyor for the City of Melbourne for 3 years, and prior to that, Stephen was the MBS at the City of Port Phillip for 11 years. He worked at the City of Monash for 12 years and the City of Waverley for 4 years. He has formal qualifications in building surveying and fire engineering, and has dedicated the last 12 years of his spare time as a volunteer judge to the Housing Awards for the Housing Industry Association. Stephen is passionate about fire safety in buildings and is a professional member of the Fire Protection Association of Australia. Stephen is also a current serving member of the Building Regulations Advisory Committee, BRAC, and as appointed by the Minister, a member of the Australian Institute of Building Surveying and Vice President of the Victorian Municipal Building Surveyors Group. Our fourth panelist, Wayne Liddy, has over 25 years of experience as a building surveying practitioner and over 30 years in building control. A director of the Gardner Group, Pty Ltd, a multi-skilled building surveying and consultancy company, and a fellow vice president and board director of the Australian Institute of Building Surveyors. He is currently the AIBS's nominated representative on the Building Regulations Advisory Committee. He's a former chair of the AIBS National Technical Committee and also served as a member of the AIBS National Education Committee. Wayne has served on the Building Practitioners Board, Victoria, and also the Building Advisory Council. Wayne has also tutored at Melbourne University, Construction Regulation A Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. Having worked and consulted in both the private and public sectors, Wayne has broad-ranging skills and experiences, both in the construction industry and specifically in relation to the area of building control. He has strengths in domestic and commercial construction, legislation interpretation, building and practitioner auditing, problem solving, mentoring, and having been engaged on many significant projects over the years, a practical approach to project implementation. Our fifth and final panelist is Stephen Kipp, Director of Skip Consulting, an engineering and regulatory consultancy firm for the past 12 years. Prior to that, he has held senior engineering positions with Warrington Fire Research, which is now Exova Warrington, if anyone recalls their history. And Building Research Association of New Zealand, which is BRANZ, and was the Deputy to the Building Commissioner at the Building Control Commission in Victoria. He's a board member of the Australian Building Codes Board, a Fellow of Engineers Australia, an Adjunct Associate Professor of the School of Engineering and Science at Victoria University, an Honorary Fellow of the University of Melbourne School of Architecture, and a former member of the Victorian Building Appeals Board. Wow, guys, it's a lot of experience to go through. So just before we move on to a presentation by Jonathan Barnett, I will point out to the audience that we do have a Q&A feature enabled in this webinar. I imagine it would show at the bottom of your Zoom window where people can post questions in and vote them up or down, and we'll answer them as we go through this talk. There may be a couple polls during this, and when they do happen, I will launch them and they should pop up on your screen. Last and final feature, we do have a chat. The chat is generally towards everyone, but we won't particularly be monitoring that. So I guess off to Jonathan. You need to unmute your microphone.
Were we going to do the poll first?
Which one? Is DtS safe?
Yes.
Sure, let's do that.
So while I start, we're also going to have a poll. Now, is my presentation on everyone's screen? Okay, so we're going to just do a very brief intro. As with Steven Kipp, as a former professor, I tend to like to lecture for an hour, but I've been told I'm only allowed a few minutes. So we'll try to move quickly through these slides. In the meantime, you can click on the poll, is DtS safe? We'll see if you feel that way after my talk. Obviously, everything starts with the building code, and a reminder is not needed for this audience, but as you know, it's a performance code with performance requirements at the top, and you can meet the performance requirements either through a performance solution and or through a DtS solution, and that's the key of our discussion today. The performance solution either directly complies with a performance requirement or can be shown to be equivalent to the DtS solution. Remembering that our whole topic is DtS safe, this could mean that a performance solution does not meet the performance requirement and is not safe if the premise that DtS isn't always safe is true. So that's an interesting thing. Going back in time to the 1990s, this was the exciting time here. We had the second performance-based building code implemented in the world. The first was New Zealand. The UK beat both of us, but they didn't implement their performance-based code for a few years after us. We also introduced private certification. We got rid of the clerk of works. Those were exciting days and really the start of our current journey. So let's talk about deemed as in deemed to satisfy. What do we really mean? Well, the deeming rate for singles is 0.25% for assets. So if you're about to become a pensioner, the government looks and decides whether it's appropriate based on the expected income, right? And that currently is this formula that you see up here on the screen. It's really interesting. This is determined by the Minister for Social Services. He sets the rates. They reflect expert advice about what the markets are doing. So in these, the deeming rate is something that changes periodically as the circumstances require. What about deemed to satisfy in our building regulations? Well, what does it mean? Well, judged or considered, as in the design is judged to satisfy the performance requirements.
Jonathan, can I just pause you for a second? We seem to be getting comments coming in that the presentation slides aren't visible. So can some people just put in the chat there if you can see that? Right. Jonathan, have you been going through these slides?
Yes.
Okay, so we can't actually see your slide. Are you able to do a screen share and make sure that your slides are selected?
All right. So maybe something happened.
There we go. We can see something now.
You can see the slide now? Okay.
1990s?
Yep.
Yep. All right, cool.
All right.
Great.
Good knows. Who knows what happened? All right. The joy of technology. Well, all right. So as I was talking about the deeming rate, that's that slide. We'll skip through this. The important thing is that the rate that is deemed appropriate is set by a minister for social services. When we come to the building code, the deemed to satisfy, and I've translated as saying, the design is judged to satisfy the performance requirements if we meet the deemed to satisfy provisions of the code. Judged by whom? Obviously, like in the deeming rate, there's a minister who sets, well, no, there isn't a minister. There's the minister's forum. Well, in any case, however the deemed to satisfy is established, they reflect expert advice just about the science of combustion. That would be current research. So as research is continuously occurring. So can the slides still be seen? No. I'm seeing that people still can't see the slides.
The slide that I can see now says judged by whom?
Yeah, but I'm looking at Q&A and people can't see it.
They could be old messages.
Okay.
The audience says they can see it, so
they can? Okay, everyone can see it now? Yeah. Good, okay, hooray. So, I promised I wasn't gonna spend more than 15 minutes on my talk, so this time that we're battering about doesn't count. Otherwise, I have to buy beers for all the other panelists. Okay, so the minister, what minister? Anyway, deemed to satisfy should reflect expert advice about the science of combustion, methods and materials of constructions and changes therein, changes in society's acceptance of loss, changes in society's willingness to pay. You think about the post-COVID world, perhaps we don't have as much money to pay what we want to pay. So I see there's still some questions about people still can't see the current slides. Blair, I see you say you can't see it. Could you type and let us know if you can or can't?
Jonathan, if you're looking at the Q&A box, I am dismissing those questions as we go along.
Oh, okay.
So I think we're good to go. Just keep presenting, and if there's something comes up, I'll let you know.
So the sad part is, or the questionable part is, that most DtS provisions haven't significantly changed in 20 years. That's great. It means that we got it right 20 years ago. The building design, therefore, is presumed, reckoned, viewed, believed, considered to meet the performance requirements. And that's what deemed to satisfy means. But who decides if this is true? Who decides what change should be made? Well, the ABCB declares it so, and the Ministers' Forum adopted. King Canute declared the tide shall stop. Didn't seem to stop, and he almost drowned in Bosham near Chichester. Anyway, where's all this come from? Let's go back to 1837 and look at the building regulations for the town of Sydney. Really, really interesting. In those days, they worried about making sure that exterior walls were built in such a way that fire didn't spread from building to building. And in fact, each community had its own building code, building regulation, and eventually they all came together and became the amalgamated state building codes. So by 1990, we actually had a building code of Australia that was something that had a little bit of this and a little bit of that from all of the other building codes, mostly New South Wales. How did we get from 1837 to 1990? Well, there were changes in technology, changes in materials, changes in due to fires. We learned lessons from real fires, and building regulations changed. And this is what happens throughout the world. This is common wherever we are. Let's talk about a change. This happens to be a change in warehouse. So in 1978, we were busy getting rid of chlorofluorocarbons, obviously because of the problem with the ozone layer. And we replaced chlorofluorocarbon propellants in cans of paint, aerosols, with propane or butane. Kmart had a beautiful warehouse. It was sprinklered, it had firewalls, it had doors, and it had a fire. And the aerosols ignited. And because of the propane and butane, they became little rockets and the entire building burnt down. So our building regulations changed, and we now put aerosols inside a cage in order to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So when we look at our building code, it was based on historic fires. It didn't account for new construction materials, right? So for example, when we looked at the 3-story low-rise construction on combustible construction materials, it was based on timber cladding back in the 90s when Von Beck did the risk assessment compared to new materials that we have today. It didn't account for new hazards and didn't account for updated engineering capabilities because we just didn't know that we would have FDS and we wouldn't have all these amazing computer tools back when we wrote the code in 1990. Let's talk about a few examples where deemed dissatisfied doesn't work, and then the panelists will have more discussion about this. So think about spandrels. The spandrel requirement is they need to be 900 millimeters in height, 600 millimeters above the upper surface of the intervening floor, and they have to be non-combustible. The problem is that 900 millimeters may not be enough. It depends on the shape of the window opening. This is research, it's very old research, it's 20 years old. It should have changed the deemed to satisfy for spandrels, but it didn't. It was done in New Zealand, so maybe we just sort of ignore it because it was far across the sea. But the bottom line is research shows that 900 is not enough if you've got a tall, narrow window. And yet our building regulation still has a deemed to satisfy of 900 millimeters. Think about exit door swings. Exit doors need to swing in the direction of egress, but doors on the path of travel do not. But people still have to go through the doors, whether it's on the path of travel or the last door out. So the issue is whether or not there's queuing, not which way the door swings and where it's located, but we should be looking at queuing, and yet deemed to satisfy says it doesn't matter if it's on the path of travel. Here's another good one. Our current fire resistance level, FRL, for doors to fire rated stairs is -6030. It used to be -6060. Nothing has changed except to get the -6060 rating, we had asbestos in the doors. Well, when we banned asbestos, we found it was just too expensive to make a door that had the -6060, so we just changed the required rating. So that was a place where the deemed to satisfy changed, not because of safety, but simply because of cost. While we're on the topic of FRLs, let's talk about AS 1530 Part 4. We just need to remember this is the test that determines the fire resistance levels. It doesn't test full-scale assemblies, but large ones. The test cannot predict time to failure in a building fire, though. It predicts time to failure in the test. So a 60-minute tested assembly might last 20 minutes in a real fire or 10 hours in a real fire, and yet it still has the same rating. If we assume that it failed at 60 minutes and the door and the assembly, let's say a column or a beam, collapsed in 20 minutes, which is certainly possible, and we design for that, then the deemed to satisfy provision gives us the wrong information. Deemed to satisfy says it should last 60 minutes perhaps, when in reality it might only last 20. But it's okay because we have an old history of FRLs. It goes back to the 1880s. We should be comfortable about it. It was codified about 100 years ago at the National Bureau of Standards in America, but those tests were done using railroad ties and furniture of the day, which were timber. How does that apply to the plastic desks that we have today and chairs and the like? So the bottom line is that the FRL, which is only deemed to satisfy, it's not a performance requirement, doesn't account for full-scale effects. Structural frame redundancies due to moment connections are ignored. At the same time, structural frame behavior due to weak connections are also ignored. So sometimes it's conservative, sometimes it's not. That's a problem. Here's another good one. Are all deemed to satisfy provisions equally safe? Let's look at external walls. We're going to look at fiber reinforced cement sheeting, bonded laminated materials, concrete, solid aluminum. So the first two are combustible elements that are allowed to be used where non-combustible is required, such as in type A or B construction. And concrete and solid aluminum are used where non-combustible is required. So here we're looking at a large-scale test, 5113, of fiber reinforced cement sheeting. This is allowed by the code to be used. Oops. You probably don't want to be near that test when that blew out. On the other hand, a bonded laminate material, one that was tested, total mass on the ground is 16 kilograms, you're allowed to have 2. The largest piece was less than 2. A test of a concrete wall, 83 kilograms on the ground, you're allowed to have less than 2. Solid aluminum, which is the flavor of the month. So we're replacing products like a Pollock FR with solid aluminum sheets, which are much safer, except that when you test it to the full scale, we had one test where there were 44 kilograms on the ground, 23 kilogram piece. You probably don't want to be hit by that, yet it's deemed to satisfy. It's kind of scary. The deemed to satisfy doesn't require any design for egress if you're in a wheelchair or if you're disabled. This usually means that in the event of a fire or other emergency, disabled people won't have the same level of safety as others. And you or I could be disabled tomorrow. We can break a leg, sprain an ankle, and then we also will have difficulty going up and down a stair. So I'm going to conclude by a couple of questions. First, do building surveyors have discretion to ignore the deemed to satisfy provisions and require more? An answer isn't as obvious as you think. The panelists will talk about that. What about fire engineers? From their code of ethics, fire engineers are required to be discerning and do what's right. They must act appropriately when they perceive something is wrong. Fire engineers must act if deemed to satisfy isn't safe. But that's confusing, isn't it? Are we really required to build safe buildings? How safe is safe enough? How does a municipal building surveyor decide if a building is safe? When the authority having jurisdiction asserts that a deemed to satisfy building is safe, are they correct? I don't know. Let's find out what the panel says.
Okay, so if we could have the panelists unmute their mics there. And I'll cancel my spotlight. Okie doke. So, question for Jonathan, being a Yank, does America have the same problem updating its building codes to reflect the current body of knowledge, or is this unique to Australia?
Well, I think that we're slow. America goes through a code cycle like we do every 3 years, although we do it more frequently with the amendments. But in America, changes in research, changes in testing are often incorporated in the code within 6 years at the longest. I used to be on ASTM, and our changes happen within a 6-year cycle. So the answer is America seems to be faster, but its code is simpler because it's not a performance-based code. It's basically all prescriptive.
Right. We do have a question from one of our attendees. Came in as more of a comment. And they said, unfortunately, people review deemed to satisfy only within their own expert area. And there's the issue of siloing how building designs are looked at. Anyone on the panel here can answer that. How have you guys experienced siloing, and how has it negatively impacted the safety of a design?
Yeah, Jonathan, so first of all, thank you to Basic Expert for letting us speak today. The technology is interesting and fun. The best example of that is disability egress that Jonathan mentioned in his presentation. So fire safety engineers deal with egress systems, and disability access consultants deal with access systems, and we hardly ever speak to each other. And that's a significant public safety issue that hasn't really eventuated yet. In fact, we've had 4 deaths in house fires of people in wheelchairs in the last 2 years, but none of those buildings are subject to egress requirements anyway. But yeah, it's a sleeper issue. But until we have a significant issue, probably governments won't push very hard on that because it's quite an internationally difficult problem to solve.
Right. I'd like to hear from Andrew Cialini on this issue and his views from the VBA.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. So I'd probably just like to sort of address one of the promotional items in regards to the VBA disagreeing with the statement that DtS provisions may not provide an adequate level of safety. I think the statement referred to was in relation to a response from a VBA building surveyor assessing a fire engineering brief that included the reference to a deemed to satisfy solution, and not providing an adequate level of fire safety. From my perspective as a regulator and a building surveyor, the deemed to satisfy provisions are law and are the minimum compliance standard set by the government. And as noted by Jonathan, deemed to satisfy provisions have been deemed as an acceptable standard by the Australian Buildings Code Board. And if you comply with the deemed to satisfy, the building is deemed to have met the minimum standards set by the ABCB.
So it basically brings us to the point, and probably Steven Baxas now. Can a matter be deemed to satisfy and still pose a danger? And as a municipal building surveyor yourself, Steven Baxas, can the municipal building surveyor issue a building notice or order relating to a matter that is deemed to satisfy?
Thanks, Jonathan. A good question, and one that I'm faced with regularly. So yes, I think the answer is yes. If we look at, say, for example, balustrading in buildings, DP3 gives us the performance requirement. It says words to the effect that a barrier must be, of a height to protect a person from falling. So a person, what type of person? Are we talking about a tall person, a short person? We know what the DtS tells us. The DtS tells us that 1 metre is adequate. But we're also aware that there are other studies, and there's been accidents in the past that have been looked at by the courts, where experts have given evidence that, because of the evolving height of humans, that possibly a height of, 1.2 or 1.3 is more appropriate for a balustrade. But, the DtS is 1 metre. So what does it mean? Not all buildings are the same. When people interfere with buildings and place things, fixed things, or even temporary portable things like tables, chairs, and air conditioning compressors adjacent to say, balustrades on a balcony, it effectively creates a climbable element that probably shouldn't be there. Now, the DtS doesn't talk about that. If you look at swimming pool barriers, there's a very clear requirement to have an exclusion zone. And you have an arc that you have to measure, a 900mm arc, and nothing can be climbable within that zone. There's no such thing for a balustrade on a balcony. So I find myself having to identify risks on a case-by-case basis, and I have issued notices and orders to try and alleviate some of these risks. You know, another good example is combustible cladding and the use of, say, combustible elements on a building that are attachments. They're DtS. You can have a combustible element on a building as long as it's an attachment. There's a performance requirement within the DtS that says that it can't unduly spread fire up a building. So, you know, we have to use a judgment call, and I have to use a judgment call quite often. And if I come to the conclusion that I feel that there's a risk there, I've issued dozens of notices that relate to that matter alone. So there's a couple of examples that are real life examples for me.
Right. On the topic of disability and deemed to satisfy being basically a minimum standard, but at the moment seems to be the standard, you know, when there's corporate money involved in construction. How could we improve some of the egress route, I guess, deemed to satisfy provisions to allow for people with disabilities to either be safe while someone comes to collect them, or for them to be able to evacuate, say, a building that that you can get into it with elevators, but you can't get out of it in an egress situation using the elevators. Anyone can answer that one.
So Jonathan, I think one of the things that's most confusing about this is the word safe. It's really difficult to define. It's not one in the legislation at all. And just coming back to Andrew's point, the deemed to satisfy provisions are not mandatory, but they set a prescriptive benchmark. That's done because, as altruistically advantageous as performance-based regulations are, what you need for a system to work is verifiable, repeatable, consistent, easily educated and easily audited provisions. So in an ideal world, performance-based speed limits would be perfect, but the practical reality is a big white sign with a red circle and a number works because it's pragmatic. The dilemma is that regulations lag behind public policy. And we know there's a theoretical problem around disabled egress, but no evidence of an actual problem. And politicians, quite rightly, shouldn't react until there's clear evidence of an actual problem. Mm-hmm. This is we could have the same debate about climate change. You know, most of our deemed to satisfy provisions don't reflect climate change. They reflect data from historical evidence. They're not looking forward. And we have to be careful that these minimum standards don't become best practice, which is a concern that I have as an ABCB board member. The law should be the minimum standard, and then people should choose how much above that they need to be at. Disabled egress, though, is a tricky one, and that's why, for example, there are amendments coming in to deal with childcare centres in high-rise buildings. It's a theoretical problem, but a significant one that the public has an interest in now. Disabled egress is just exceptionally problematic, and actually we have a performance requirement, DP7, with no deemed to satisfy provisions at all to use lifts for evacuation for that reason. Mm-hmm. But to say that a fully deemed to satisfy compliant building is safe when it doesn't deal with people with a disability at all is misleading, if not fraudulent.
So as Stephen Kipp, as a board member of the ABCB, one of our attendees has asked you to provide some insight on what the ABCB is doing to ensure that these deemed to satisfy provisions meet the performance requirements.
Yeah, so there's a 10-year work program, and we're about halfway through it. I'm trying to improve the deemed to satisfy provisions to the point at which they are verified. Mm-hmm. There probably will always be deemed to satisfy provisions for the reasons I just mentioned, because you need verifiable, repeatable, consistent numerical solutions. But where a verification method is introduced and the deemed to satisfy provision can verify compliance, then it's no longer going to be a deemed to satisfy provision. It'll be renamed as an acceptable prescriptive solution or something like that. But the idea that we will have a fully quantitative performance-based building code and no deemed to satisfy provisions because they'll all be verified, that's a piece of work that is perhaps a decade or two in the making, and we're about a quarter of the way through that at the moment. But handrail heights is a good example. So the ABCB now knows and discusses reasonably regularly that handrail heights in Australia are lower than China or India because their codes are newer. So India has, I think, 1.05 metres, China 1.1 metre for apartment buildings. But we don't have significant evidence of a problem. We have some evidence of a problem. Certainly, the social nature of balconies means we're seeing an increase in very small numbers of people falling off balconies or being pushed off balconies and things like that. But at the moment, there's no reason to increase that numerical outcome. But if someone came to you and said, can we reduce our handrail height below 1 metre, you'd have to say no immediately because you know they're deemed to satisfy is not conservative. Ceiling heights, tread widths, there's a whole list of things that I've scribbled down before the meeting. For example, and I think it's actually unfair to compare codes from different countries because countries react to the problem that they have before them. If you want to look at Australia and New Zealand had some significant bushfires in Christchurch a few years ago, but have no meaningful provisions in their building code. So Australia has quite significant provisions for domestic construction for bushfire, but not much for earthquake. New Zealand has the exact opposite. New Zealand have very onerous requirements for earthquake and not much for bushfire. So government's role is to intervene when there's a demonstrated public interest. But engineers and architects and other building practitioners, our role is to try and make buildings as future-proof as we can and not just build to minimum standards.
That's great. That's a great response, very detailed. Another question, this is for the general panel, came in from Ari Akrititis, a name that we all are familiar with. Do you think there is a disconnect regarding the appetite for performance-based design between the federal government and the state government regulators?
I'll pipe up on this one. I don't know about appetite. I think there's probably a lack of understanding in the be it government sector, in the supply chain of regulation, and be it governments through to designers, through to building surveyors, and through to those constructing. I think there's a failure to truly understand performance as opposed to the historic DtS provisions. And we have to look at the fundamentals of performance and who was designing, who was deemed an expert, who was providing the expert judgment. I'm speaking very holistic manner here, but what we are seeing is that there are very limited experts within the supply chain that can develop a performance solution. And I'm not just talking about fire, I'm talking about every facet within the BCA, for want of a better term. And that then leads to those assessing. So if we've got a shortfall in experts providing performance or designing performance solutions, then that will then translate to the role of the building surveyor in the assessment. And then if it's beyond the building surveyor's capabilities, who can they then reach out to? And then that then leads on to the construction phase of a building and the understanding of the difference between a DtS design and a performance-based design of a building.
Does anyone else want to answer that?
Yeah, but doesn't this create a very interesting problem, Wayne? Because how does a regulator, and it could be the private certifier, it could be an MBS, it could be the VBA, how do they actually determine if we are violating the Building Act by building a building that's unsafe when buildings are so complicated? So the deemed to satisfy, and Stephen hit on this earlier, the deemed to satisfy is sort of easy, it's the checkbox. But as soon as you hit a performance solution, who's to judge? Unfortunately, the state of the art of fire engineering, and it's been like this certainly my entire career, is that if we take 4 fire engineers and put them in a room together, they might very likely come up with 4 different ways of solving the same problem. If you put 10 in a room, they probably on average will agree on what is an appropriate solution and what isn't. If you have a single fire engineer, then we have a problem. And even with 2, we have a problem because there isn't enough, there's too much expert judgment that's needed And by the way, one of that leads to a final point, which others might want to comment on, is the role of expert judgment. Some people don't want to see any expert judgment, except you always have expert judgment in every engineering design. You have to. Think about using a computer model. I used to teach 15-year-olds how to do fire modeling, right? It was great. They go home, model their home, have their parents die in the fire, whatever the 15-year-old wanted. It was always kind of cool. It was like a video game, right? The problem
Sounds like playing The Sims.
Exactly. But do we want that 15-year-old designing our building? No. Why do we hire a fire engineer to do it? Because the fire engineer brings expert judgment to use of the model. So the difficulty is that you, as a single building surveyor, if you're not sure about a fire engineering design, a performance solution, and get another opinion, and it happens to be different, how do you know which one to choose? If you're the regulator and you only have one fire engineer on your staff, how do you decide what's right and what's not right? And because so much of our code is performance-based, you can't do it just by ticking the box saying, yes, it's deemed to satisfy. You've got to have proper engineering analysis, and that adds cost, and it's a challenge. On the other hand, you know, with good fire engineering, maybe you're saving 2, 3, 4 million in the building, and the cost is 50, 100,000. So what's the big deal? The trick is we need to get through our heads that proper engineering costs money, and we should spend money for it, particularly if we're going to look at a building holistically. And deemed to satisfy is not enough, as Stephen kept. We have to look at a whole building to understand what's appropriate and future-proof it.
So John, Andrew.
Yeah, I think there's some good points there. I think we're showing the issues with both the deemed to satisfy and the performance solutions, that the DtS can't be broad enough to cover all situations. So they are a baseline, a benchmark, and then you've got your performance to pick up the complexities in our system. But that complexity makes it difficult for whoever's assessing. And I think the current system issue we have currently is that that's really left to the building surveyor. So the building surveyor is left with making that decision at the end of the process. And I think there needs to be more accountability in the system that basically brings that back to the designers. I think a number of the other states with their OH&S legislation have sort of introduced the concept of safety in design, which sort of goes some way to that concept where the designers are actually responsible for considering the individual nature of each building, each project, each circumstance, and are responsible for managing that risk. And they need to be able to justify that their design will manage that risk. And if they're proven not to, then that's where the issue will be. And we've seen in other states that the designers take on a lot more of the responsibility then, that design process involves the whole team, the stakeholders, and it is to a degree similar to the way the performance solution process should work, but there's more buy-in from the designers that they are also accountable. So they're actually driving the process. The architects, the engineers, the builders are all driving the outcome for not meeting the minimum requirement, which is unfortunately where the building industry generally is at, is let's sort of dive for that minimum based on cost.
Jonathan, can I jump in there? Andrew's raised some really interesting points there. And it's probably in the context of today's topic, and some points that Andrew raised there about how, and I think about how they relate to the construction phase of a building project. Now, whether that's domestic or commercial, this all starts with the level of documentation. Is it a design for under the DtS provisions or designed by a performance solution? And in most cases, and I even think about domestic dwellings, obviously through to commercial buildings, in most cases it's a combination of both. So then we probably need to consider the role. Obviously you've got the consideration of the person assessing it being the building surveyor, but then there's the role of the builder and those installing, and then that of the building inspector. It's a minefield. Is the installer, the builder, fully equipped and have the understanding of the design and the approval process to actually construct the building? And is there a level of documentation and a transparent method of RBS decision making that is clear for the building inspector to fulfill their functions? So to pick up a document, first of all, it's got to be the process starts with an adequate level of or more than adequate level of documentation, and it works its way through the supply chain, and the building's got to be built. And is there an understanding? We know that we have facade installers, and we have carpenters on site, and they're probably not undertaking the traditional role that they were many years ago qualified for. So we might have plasterers installing fire collars these days, and this just shows the complex nature of it. So a couple of points that Andrew made, and it just shows that through the supply chain there is a combination of DtS and performance design of a building, and the construction phase of a building is so complex, and I dare say that people constructing would be just as confused as the rest of the industry.
Right. So I guess that brings us into another point. The majority of our BCA and the deemed to satisfy provisions are about 40 years old. So do you think it's now time for the ABCB to start engaging industry experts from around the country and start work on developing and updating these provisions, just like in the US, New Zealand and Sweden, possibly, hopefully with some real data, and to make that system adapt to it quickly?
Yeah, that question felt like it was aimed right at me, Jonathan, so I'll take it.
Sure.
First of all, we need to understand that there is no perfect performance-based code anywhere in the world, and our code is no better or worse than any other countries. I've seen no evidence to the contrary, but and I don't think we answered Ari's question well either. So the question about why we're blaming performance for our regulatory failures is a bit like the problem of if everybody is speeding or drink driving, it's either the legislation is wrong or there isn't enough auditing and enforcement. In my view, in the building industry, it's not that the evidence that the legislation is not perfect is clear, but I don't see any evidence that it's the actual problem. It's a cultural problem around minimum standards and a lack of auditing and enforcement to protect people who have been trying to do the right thing for decades. Now so we can pick holes in the building code in any country forever, and it doesn't prove or disprove anything. In the same way that wherever you go around the world, the speed limit will be slightly different. There's no right or wrong, but auditing and enforcement of compliance is the issue. And I'll come back to the satisfied provisions are really important. I think you need three things for regulatory success. You need a clear trade network that can do the work. You need a prescriptive standard that's well understood, either deemed to satisfy or something else. And if you think about carpentry, a clear trade network that goes back thousands of years, a very clear prescriptive standard, 1684, and then a CPD scheme. And again, when 1684 is amended, the builder groups run CPD schemes across the country. That's why, for example, in my view, there is no problem in the carpentry part of our building code and no reason to register carpenters. Now take that to combustible cladding, whatever the material is, to non-compliant cladding. We can't even agree on which trade's meant to put it up. There is no compliance standard, and therefore there can't be a CPD scheme. That was destined to fail and needs to be fixed up by auditing and enforcement, because we can't write building codes fast enough to deal with innovation. We haven't caught up with polystyrene and polyethylene to even start thinking about polyurethane, polypropylene, composite timbers, high pressure laminates. So I think this problem is actually about culture, and the states that are struggling are confusing the problem as one about regulation that's broken. And it's not, in my view, it's not the case at all.
So then you would disagree with the proposal before the minister in Victoria to ban certain products for cladding. An outright ban, for example, on anything with any aluminium composite panel with more than a 7% PE core, and all EPS, such as you might have in QT, which has only 10 to 20% EPS.
Yeah, so if a minister's going to ban something that's already illegal, we should also ban slavery and asbestos and whatever else you want to think of. So I understand the messaging that politicians might want to do with that, but the reality is that polystyrene on type A and B construction has never been approved. Now, if it went through a legitimate performance solution, including fire brigade consent and industry approval and insurance sign-off, then that is okay in my view. But we're actually banning things that are already never been legal. Thanks, Andrew. I was trying to bring you in. I knew that.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And like I think there's a bit of conflict in your statements there, because previously you were saying that we can't keep up with all the change and the products, and I think that is one of the purposes of the ban. It's basically acknowledging that we can't keep up with that knowledge base that we need to be able to make those decisions in a performance-based world. So it's basically saying, well, until we actually catch up, until we get the confidence in the system and the process, maybe we need to provide a full ban that will then allow everyone to basically sit down, take stock, and reset.
But Andrew, I'll create a new ACP that uses a different plastic core that's far worse. Your ban will do nothing but allow me to create dangerous buildings. What we need is to enforce the performance requirements of the code, but that's too hard to do unless the regulator hires more fire engineers so we can do it properly. And this is one of my big problems. Why don't we have more of the professionals involved in the regulatory environment?
Can I jump into that point, Andrew? Look, in my view, the polystyrene issue is worse in Victoria than anywhere else in the country. And it's worse because Victoria pushed for energy efficiency requirements ahead of the national model in the early 2000s. It's anecdotal evidence, but it's my view that's how we got there. So if you look at that as an example, the deemed to satisfy provisions for energy efficiency are now becoming historically outdated. The building code brought those provisions in the 90s to push for sustainability in our building code, and we've never achieved sustainability. Energy efficiency is only one of a dozen key parts of a sustainability framework. So if we ban one of the products that we only actually started using because it was there to suit another deemed to satisfy provision, we're actually making the problem worse. So if we ban polystyrene, we'll have to go to another highly energy efficient material to replace it with, and they're all combustible, Andrew. They're all combustible.
So I guess we've got another question here. Would you guys prefer to live in an apartment building that's just deemed to satisfy compliance, or one that had a well-designed, peer-reviewed, performance-based solution?
That's a poll question, or
a poll question, or a question for us?
No, I'd actually like you guys to answer that one.
Yeah, I can start. I'd be happy to live in either, on the proviso that it is a well-designed, performance-based building. So I think they've both got valid outcomes. I think a well-designed, performance-based building will hopefully get you value as well. So the deemed to satisfy building is probably, in some instances, is going to cost you more. That you can actually, the beauty of performance solution is you can actually tailor it to the specifics of the actual individual building. But the problem is that the big sort of kicker is properly designed performance solution, and whether we can actually, whether we've evolved to a point where that process is occurring to actually have that outcome.
So it's interesting, the apartment I bought, part of the due diligence process was to find out who the fire engineer was. As soon as I heard who it was, I said, okay, I'll buy that. I know that the maintenance will be high because we've got to maintain all the systems he's designed, but I know that the building will be safe, right? And I wasn't able to see the fire engineering report until I actually became an owner. And then having read it, I said, good, I'm glad I'm living here.
If I could jump in there.
Well, the only problem was that the cladding was non-compliant and the fire engineer didn't know it. His fire engineering report addressed it, but unfortunately the builder messed up. So luckily for me, Cladding Safety Victoria is about to replace the cladding on my building, so I'm happy.
So Steven Baxas there had a comment, so we'll let him.
Yeah, no, look, following on from that, look, to answer the question, in theory, the DtS building should be safe. Knowing what I know about performance, a performance building should be equally as safe, if not safer. It would look at the performance requirements, as Stephen Kipp mentioned earlier. There simply aren't DtS clauses in the BCA to satisfy all the performance requirements. So a proper thought out performance solution for a building should ultimately be better. The problem, I think, lies in these complex buildings that people don't know how to maintain. And I, as the MBS, see the other side of it. And a lot of you consultants also see that. But buildings are not predictable anymore because they're all performance-based, and the documentation isn't readily available to understand a building for the professionals, let alone for the owners who I guess, charged with the responsibility of maintaining that building. So I guess to answer the question again, yes, performance should provide a more high-tech solution. However, 5 or 10 years down the track, who can guarantee that that building's been maintained?
But an example of that is the Neo apartment building, Steve. Right? That building wasn't properly maintained, but because the fire engineering was so good and the systems were so well thought out, despite everything going wrong, combustible cladding, doors not working, et cetera, the alarm and detection not functioning properly, no one died. The building was a gem because of the brilliance of the fire engineer.
It had a lot of redundancy in it. That's true. That's a good example.
Can I come to that question, Jonathan? So there's a better way to phrase that question, or better from my point of view, to prove a point, I guess. So if you talk about a 3-story apartment building, who would move their wheelchair-bound mother, grandmother, child into that building on level 3 of a 3-story building, because the deemed to satisfy provisions wouldn't require sprinklers or disabled egress. And a well-designed fire safety engineered building would have probably sprinklers to deal with the disabled egress issue. And if you phrase the question that way, the answer actually, it answers itself. So well-designed buildings will always be safer. Not sometimes, they actually will always be safer. And you say that when you look at well-designed hospitals, and we've got some of the best designed buildings in the world in Australia, just also some of the worst designed ones as well. So the blind faith reliance on deemed to satisfy is the problem. And I think that's part of the problem. Is if you take a deemed to satisfy building and then measure your performance solution as at least as good or bad as that deemed to satisfy provision, then that's a problem. When the BCA 96 was trained across the country, I was one of the ones in Victoria who did some of the training to people like Wayne, who smiles as I say it. We were very, Stephen Harkin, a lawyer who worked for the Building Control Commission at the time, we were very concerned about what we called double deeming. If you have blind faith reliance on the deeming provisions and you prove your designs at least as good as that, or at least as bad as that, then that's no defence at all for an engineer. The argument that my building's no worse than deemed to satisfy because I also didn't do anything about disabled egress is a nonsense.
So Stephen, this almost answers one of the questions from an audience member there, when they asked, surely an AS 5113 system is far superior to a deemed to satisfy construction method. So do you agree with that statement?
Well, so verification methods. So there's a challenging debate about whether our building code is too complex or not. If you want an innovative, flexible building code, you have to accept levels of complexity which we currently have. We can go back to brick, concrete, steel buildings if you want, but we have to accept construction costs will go up very much. So 5113, if you talk about it in the context of the verification method, is deliberately set at a policy level higher than deemed to satisfy for that reason. To set a clear message to innovative products that they have to pass a very high benchmark. It's again another argument. Why would you ban products when we have a verification method in the building code that actually deals with it? And if the scheme was audited and enforced properly, you could never get any of these bad products through the verification method or a peer-reviewed performance solution. So that comes back to that point about why ban things that are already well catered for in legislation. Admittedly, it's complex legislation. And the answer is, I'm sure Andrew answered this really well. The answer is because governments want to send a clear message. But the message is don't use innovation in the building industry, and that will cost us in terms of not just cost, but in better quality buildings.
Mm-hmm.
But Jonathan, if I can jump in there, but what we're seeing here and the failures that have brought about the notion of banning products, they're failings in the regulatory framework that, unfortunately, and as a building surveyor, I find that building surveyors, and now certainly fire engineers, are going to cop the wrath of it, but being conveniently blamed for regulatory failure. And I see that the cladding issue is just a symptom of regulatory failure. It's a lack, an historic lack of such things as oversight and auditing. It's a historic, and I'm talking about a Victorian issue here, as a Victorian, but also the lack of, when I say regulatory oversight and auditing, there's also the policy unit where we don't have a mandatory requirement for CPD. Training, education, which is they're the fundamentals behind what we do every day, every person, every audience member today. It starts with education, and if we look at the performance provisions, I do remember those days, Stephen, back in 1996, and funnily enough, you had exactly the same haircut, but we spoke in those days about experts and subject matter experts and design of performance solutions, and people should be experts in, as an example, human movement when we're considering steps and rises and things like that. We don't see that. Yeah, that's really all I've got to say on that point.
There have been a series of questions about the fire safety verification method that tie into all of this. Yes. So one of them was actually to Steven and myself, and that is using DtS as a benchmark in the fire safety verification method. And the other is a question of why are so many fire engineers against the use of the method? The odd thing I'll point out is that the fire safety verification method requires 3 or 4 times the amount of work versus a normal performance solution, because you have to look at scenarios that you would normally just discard because they're ridiculous. And because of the unexpected catastrophic collapse scenario, you need a structural engineer who's trained in fire engineering. There are only about 5 or 6 in the whole country that can do that. And so I guess the questions are being asked, why are we looking at the methodology that you're then spending a lot of money on, the fire engineers getting rich, thank you, and yet you just are comparing it to deemed to satisfy? I'll let Steve and Kip actually answer that, seeing as it was addressed to both of us.
Yeah, so CV4 has been controversial from the outset, and certainly Jonathan and I have had very spirited discussion around this topic. And as a board member, and I support the introduction of the verification method because of a range of other factors, but I have strong views that the requirement for benchmarking to deem to satisfy is misleading and potentially harmful to the success of the verification method. One of the reasons I supported it was because we also at the same time brought in a requirement that lifted the deem to satisfy benchmark in apartment buildings to sprinklers from more than 4 stories or more. So the verification method only works well if the deemed to satisfy benchmark is strong. So for example, if I applied the verification method to a bushfire prone area and I was working on a hospital building, the deemed to satisfy provisions for bushfire for a hospital in a bushfire prone area are 0. There's nothing. So how would it work practically? Now, to the point there's any disagreement between Jonathan and myself and others like Peter Johnson who've spoken very significantly about this topic, it's an attempt by government to drive better standards in the fire safety engineering profession. And again, as a board member, I felt that was a more important policy moment than the practical issues about how to apply this in reality.
Right, we seem to be getting a few questions about enforcement of the NCC. Now, as I take it, the NCC it's a code, it's a document that is available federally, but it's at the state level that its application gets decided. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yep. Okay, cool. Oh, right. Ways of policing. So we do have we've got the building authorities which do control building approvals and how that needs to be done. But is there are there alternative ways of I guess nudging the industry towards doing something a bit different? We do have one question that says, are PI insurance and exclusions precluding many performance solutions to be done by qualified fire safety engineers? Therefore, designers being forced to only accept DtS systems. So I'll put that out there as a question. Can we use that to change practice?
Well, I would even argue that using the DtS provisions may possibly have an impact on one's ability for their insurance policy to respond. I think everyone needs to have a very close look at the wording, because it's not just associated with non-compliant cladding. It comes down to the installation of a cladding system. Now, I take that as whether it's DtS or it's a performance-based design.
Anyone else?
Yeah, the question mixes two things that don't mix well together, like oil and water, probably. So, insurance is a policy benefit that you add on to a regulatory scheme. It's not mandatory. It's a really good idea. It's there to protect the consumer from economic loss, but it doesn't in any way replace safety as a goal, the core goal of regulatory systems. So insurance, unfortunately, Australia is sending the wrong signalling to the international insurance market. They don't like us. They're treating us all as red P players now, and we're paying that price, if you like, or that premium. But the reality is we don't need insurance for a good scheme to work. And I think I wrote to the Minister nearly a year ago and said there are two options in Victoria, either a government scheme for insurance or drop insurance altogether. In my view, there isn't a third option, because it's pricing the good people out of the market, and the people who are doing the wrong thing have just accelerated their wrongness in what they're doing, because they know they won't get insurance in the next few years. But insuring for economic loss doesn't in any way replace the obligations of regulators and good code writers like the ABCB to deal with a code that provides levels of safety. They're completely separate silos, to use your word, Jonathan.
Mm-hmm. So do we think that, we've got another audience question here, which I quite like. They're asking us here to comment on the capability of most building surveyors to adequately check and sign off on all aspects of a completed building. So I guess we could phrase this as more experts are needed to make these performance solutions, how can building surveyors do their job efficiently and safely if they don't have the skills within their own domain to do that?
That's very easy to answer. As building surveyors have undertaken their role for many, many years, and maybe it's been lost over time, but if building surveyors, number one, don't take on a project that is beyond their level of expertise, or two, if they find that within a project there are aspects that are either beyond their expertise or are more complex than they have experienced, then they should be calling on experts to undertake peer reviews or the like, which we have as prudent building surveyors from before the the privatisation of the industry back in 1994. So you send structural documentation out to a structural engineer for additional checking, as you do with fire engineering, send it out for peer reviewing, should you believe it complex and beyond your field of expertise to assess.
Mm-hmm. Can I jump in there, Wayne? And this is the point, we always go to somehow blame the building surveyor. Why doesn't the builder have to make that statement? When a builder takes on a project that has a complex performance-based design, surely they have to give a statement that they have the expertise, the trades, the staff, the management skills to implement that performance solution. They should have to make that statement before they're given the project. But we jump over the people who build it are the ones who you've got the best chance of getting a better outcome from, not the enforcement body at the end of the process. It's too late then.
Can I throw another spanner in the works on that one then, Stephen, that in the design and construct model, it is going at such a pace that a building does not get built unless the relevant building surveyor is actually in there assisting, which we all know is an inherent conflict of interest, but unless the relevant building surveyor is in there assisting, then we wouldn't get we would get a far worse outcome than we're seeing at the moment.
But I think part of the problem is that much of the building that we're worried about, particularly the low-rise building, are being built by builders that they don't know what they're doing. And I think that's the issue. When someone says that they're confident that they're doing it right as it is, I'm always confident they have no idea what they're doing. And that's the dilemma. And that's why we need the building surveyor as an independent person to come in and take a look. I agree the builder has responsibility, but we need checks and balances. Certainly the building surveyor is one. And then if the building surveyor, doesn't quite have the right knowledge and background, then the engineer needs to be involved. So just like Wayne was saying that it used to be that structural designs were peer reviewed by a structural engineer, I believe that fire engineering designs, particularly complex ones, should be reviewed by at least another fire engineer. One of the panelists suggested that all non-DTS designs ought to go to the Building Appeals Board for their review, but that would be kind of strange. I don't think the board's big enough to handle the load.
Yeah, right. Before we had a performance-based building code, that was the only option. So when we had regulations that were entirely prescriptive, every major project went to the Building Appeals Board, Building Referees Board it was called then. And you're right, we would never have been able to cope with the building boom we've had in the last 15 years if we kept that process going. But we also used to require high levels of peer review, which we no longer do. I've spoken to many people about the fact that I've offered in my fee submissions as a fire engineer to do final inspections for 20 years, and I've been taken up on that maybe half a dozen times in 20 years. How is it that the scheme doesn't demand that performance solutions in any area, not just fire, are required to be independently signed off at the end, and therefore there's a decision? Someone independent has to sign off at the end. They have to make a decision about what level of inspection they might do along the way to be able to satisfy themselves at the end. The DtS guidelines have this dilemma at the moment. Those guidelines require accredited fire safety engineers to sign off at the end of the project, but the engineers say, well, we don't know what the builder built. And our response is, when I'm working for DtS, that is that we would like you to do more inspections and for you to think about how often you might need to be on site to build that building. Imagine a cross-laminated timber hospital. Would you want the fire engineer to be inspecting that? I would.
Yeah, I think on that point, I think probably the answer is a tiered system, in that you've really got to get the balance between the right checks and balances and the resourcing, because the resourcing is the issue. So you really reserve the higher levels of scrutiny and for the higher risk situations, the more complex situations. And I think that's something ABCB are looking at around, the more simple and low risk items. You don't have the same requirements for peer review or independent review, and then as you sort of crank up the process, you get more involved.
But you see, instead of a ban, I would love to see the VBA put together a policy that government could pass that would make sure that the more complex buildings were addressed professionally. A ban isn't going to solve the issue. A ban is only going to solve a momentary, minor problem, which will become a major problem when people find ways around the ban. So I'd love to see the VBA be proactive in this space. I mean, this would be a great opportunity, Andrew.
There seems to be we've only got 5 minutes left, really. We have gone over time. So there seems to be a theme running in the questions here about taking into consideration other areas of practice. For example, considering a fire safety design against the requirements for plumbing, and how there may be discord in those designs. So how would a situation like that, I guess, reduce the safety of a design, and if so, how could it be dealt with? Anyone can answer.
Not if none of us know the answer, Jonathan. It's too difficult a question.
Okay, skip over that one. Look, there are a lot of questions here from the audience still. I don't think we're going to get through all of them, but do any of the panelists particularly want to take up a topic that we can wrap up with?
I'll sort of wrap up from, I know I seem to have taken a holistic, broad-based approach today, but talking about peer reviews and the requirements or industry stepping up, and Jonathan, I'll probably respond to your question to Andrew about the regulator putting in place mechanisms to force the industry to do things. Unfortunately, industry hasn't been able to take the lead themselves, and that's why we need government to do things. But I still live in hope that industry can lead the way out of this. But I'm hopeful, and being the eternal optimist and the Melbourne supporter I am, that the code of conduct that for building surveyors that will be introduced on the 1st of January will lend itself and get building surveyors thinking about their roles, that you can be the consultant building surveyor, you can be the relevant building surveyor, and on these large projects where the whole D&C model just muddies the waters, there's a great opportunity for building surveyors to really drive the standard of professional practices and the notion of peer review.
Fantastic. Gentlemen, it's been a good webinar. I will thank you all now for attending, and thanks to the audience, but I can see the numbers dropping off, so I think people are busy and having to get back to work. We look forward to doing this again soon. This was our first webinar, and we've tested the waters here, and next time we hope to do a better production. But thank you again to Jonathan Barnett, Stephen Kipp, Steven Baxas, Wayne Liddy, and Andrew Cialini.
Cheers. Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.